Hello, and welcome to the Boston Herald podcast. My name is Harold Lapidus, and today's special guest is Elizabeth Thomson, renowned journalist and author from the United Kingdom. I previously interviewed Ms. Thomson back in 2011 when this book, the restored version of No Direction Home, The Life and Music of Bob Dylan by Robert Shelton. There was an expanded edition published to celebrate Bob Dylan's 70th birthday, and that was Liz's labor of love. That I did an interview at the time, and that's in my book Friends and Other Strangers, which I'm not going to hold up. If you know me already,
I have it.
Yeah. She's also the executive producer and founder of the Village Trip Festival, a celebration of the history and heritage of Greenwich Village in New York City. I'm originally from Long Island, used to be in the village all the time. And she studied music at Liverpool University and has written for many, many publications. The first book I ever got by her was this one, John Lennon Companion. And then I got this one, too. So I've been reading stuff that she's been working on for quite some time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so both those books are, all those books are, if you're a music scholar, then you definitely want those books. And she just has published an excellent new biography of Joan Baez, The Last Leaf. And I'll link to that in my blog page that goes along with this video. And it's in my computer, so I can't show it. Do you want to hold up a copy?
I can hold up a copy, yeah. At the right angle? No, there we are.
There we go. Yep, beautiful cover.
On the back, it has a self-portrait.
Excellent. We'll get into her painting a little bit later too. So let's start by same thing I ask all these people. Everyone these days is how you're surviving this whole COVID crisis and having moronic leaders having it continue way longer than it should.
Well, yes. Well, you in the States, as we speak, look like you're about to flip your leader. We have our own Trump Tribute Act, and so we've suffered here in the UK or in England. Scotland has a much more sensible first leader, and Wales and Northern Ireland have their own kind of key people in charge. But in England, we've been beset by the kind of craziness and cronyism of giving money to dubious individuals to do things that you have in the States as well. So it's been a tricky lockdown. I should have been back and forth to New York. I came back from New York on the 27th of February, I think.
Just in time.
Never realizing that I'd never get back again, because I've been going back and forth to do this festival, as you say. So I would have been there, I would have been about 5 times since, I think. And the festival would have taken place in the last week of September. So I've been denied that. And I watched with huge sadness the scenes from Manhattan. The BBC actually filmed from Washington Square Park a bit, which was very upsetting, and of course, from elsewhere. So it was grim here, and my personal lockdown wasn't too bad. I volunteered a bit. I finished off bits of book work, the Baez, and also another version of the Shelton book, which perhaps we'll talk about a bit later on. So I've been quite busy actually. So I've been fortunate, touch wood, as we say.
So what is the perspective of us today from out there? Because it's very confusing here. It does seem optimistic temporarily, although I'm sure you know who has something up his sleeve.
Well, it's pretty scary. I mean, I felt incredibly anxious for ages. So, I mean, I can't imagine how you all have felt. And I was texting friends in New York and Philly last night, actually. And at least 2 of them were too anxious even to put the television on. They couldn't stand it. So I stayed up till 5:30 in the morning, actually. Didn't quite intend to. And I'm not quite clear. I mean, I'm just looking at the newspaper while we're waiting to talk. I think he's won Wisconsin, isn't he? And has he won Nevada? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. I've been prepping for this, so I've just looked periodically, and I saw Wisconsin. Everyone on Facebook, Wisconsin. So I guess that's good because
yes, he's won Wisconsin. So I went to bed at 5:30, and I had a lunch meeting, so I had to actually get up today as I was sleeping through. So I put on my phone terribly nervously at about 10:30, and the result hadn't changed. So I thought, oh, okay, that's relief. Because I think for you all, obviously, to have a democratic, or to get rid of Trump and have a democratic president is hugely important, even though it looks like the Democrats aren't going to win the Senate. And for us here too, because we have a little, in addition to COVID, we have a little local difference called Brexit, which happens on the 31st of December. And I think if Trump is still in office, it'll, Biden, Johnson will have a kind of friend, and we can become like a sort of 51st state, probably Puerto Rico style or something like that, which I know is not a state, but we'll be at that kind of level. If Biden gets in, I think he'll tell Johnson where to shove his various deals, and I assume we'll reset the kind of international compass to Berlin and Paris, and we'll have to get on with it, which is what we should be doing. So, and actually, someone laughed at me the other day, but I think it's not much of an exaggeration to say that the kind of future of Western civilization depends on getting rid of Trump. I think it's certainly the post-war settlement, whatever's left of it. So.
I was wondering whether you guys wanted to take us back.
Well,
I don't know. If we get Biden's the first step, and then we'll figure what happens next.
Yeah. I have to say I'm not a huge royalist, but I'm indifferent. I feel quite Queen to be going through all this at 93 or whatever she is.
So talk a little bit about Joan first, and we'll get back to her later, if I can call her Joan. So she's been quite active on social media. She did a song about Trump. She's been doing paintings. There's that iconic photo of her in front of the Trump Tower giving the finger to.
Yes.
So I just want to know if you wanted to comment on. Just for starters, just how her never-ending commitment
Activism.
to all these causes.
Commitment, yeah. Well, she's always, for most of her life, vast majority, she's not been party political. I think Obama was her first endorsement, and I think she then endorsed Bernie last time round. I don't think she endorsed anyone this time, but it was obvious, who wouldn't choose Biden. And it's been interesting that she's been painting. She's always drawn and sketched, as people who have her albums will know, because she's done some album designs, some songbooks. But this kind of phase of painting in acrylics is kind of relatively new. She had an exhibition in 2017, 18, I think, in Sonoma. She painted people she called mischief makers, which includes Dylan and Martin Luther King and various other people from the 60s, and then Václav Havel, and then she's brought it up to date with mischief makers from the current political scene. So she did Dr. Fauci a couple of weeks ago, and she did Ruth Ginsburg. Kamala Harris was recent, and then I saw Michael Moore, I think, last night. But anyway, she posted seven paintings, beginning with Emma Gonzalez, I think, leading up to the vote. Each one had a little kind of few words about the subject. And then the honor this person by voting. So the last one was Kamala Harris, and go out and vote. So it's interesting. So she didn't specifically endorse anyone, but it's clear who she wants to get in.
Yeah, I don't think she had to.
And just kind of basically supporting. No, she didn't have to. Supporting democracy and telling people they need to do their bit. And as she said in that Rolling Stone piece this week, we need empathy. We need to kind of get back to being our sisters' keeper and our brother's keeper and doing stuff for the good of the world, which she's always tried to do. I think she's been. I'm getting a message to say my internet connection's unstable. Are you okay? She's always been incredibly active, and she's been sitting at home in lockdown, quite enjoying it by all accounts, painting and early on, as you may remember, she did a few songs from her kitchen for people in Italy and France and Germany, and then obviously for the States and for so on. So she's been active. She's not giving up. She'll be active in whatever way she wants to be until her last breath, I'm sure, and I hope that's a long way off.
Oh, nice. So let's talk about you for a little bit. So you went to you studied music in Liverpool. Was music journalism your goal at the time?
Yeah.
And
no, I was I was a practical. I did piano and classical guitar and bits of clarinet and stuff. I was never going to be a performer, though I certainly played folk guitar and so on as a teenager, which is how I got into Joan Baez, really. And I intended to teach, and then I decided that was terrible. And then, having been encouraged in my writing, I did a dissertation on George Gershwin, actually. I was then casting around for what to do and maybe a postgrad when I met Robert Shelton at a Dylan event, and he got me to intern on a magazine, and he was kind of poised to try and do the final push on his book. I mean, the manuscript was stalled with his publisher. It was 1979 when we met. And I ended up being involved in that first. It was a very, very difficult decision for him. Not that he wasn't quite a tricky author to deal with. In terms that he stood up for what he believed in and did not want to sell off the relics of a friend, as he put it. So there were a lot of battles with his publisher who wanted him to do kiss and tell, I suppose. So I was kind of an ally in that, and I did the photo research first time around and was kind of reader. And actually, I think softened some of the stuff about Joan. It was a bit too music publishing briefly. Published a couple of books, and then into journalism. And actually, I spent most of my life writing about the book trade, reporting the book trade as a business. So the booksellers, the publishers, the authors, the business, which was fascinating, and it was great because it got me to New York once a year latterly. So I was down there in the village, running around covering Book Expo when it was in New York, and interviewing authors and publishers, having a great time, and in between running around the village. So the book trade is fascinating, and it gave me good contacts. And in between, I did the first of all the Lennon book, and then Dylan book, and then Bowie. Then I did the Shelton update. So I've been around the book world and done various things. Now I occasionally write about publishing, but I have my own projects.
Let's see. There were in the interview that I did with you about No Direction Home, the book. You just touched on it, but so that finally came out in 2011, and
That's right.
And you just mentioned something before we turned on the cameras about some other Shelton project.
Yeah, well, when Shelton's book was published in 1986, he said it had been, quote unquote, abridged over troubled waters, which was a very Shelton pun.
I love that quote.
It's a really good line, very typical. And because it was so late as a book, it had become dated. I mean, he'd finished it during the world tour, so backstage at Earl's Court, and then he'd been forced to add this coda to bring it up to date, the coda was very thin, and it wasn't first hand, and the book was unbalanced. And the really good stuff, that no one else had, about Dylan's parents, about the times in Minneapolis and so on, and then the times in the village when they knocked around, all got sort of shortened, in some cases cut out altogether. And he always hoped to revisit it. And then he died quite suddenly in 95, but not a great age at all, 69. Now I'm closer to that, it seems very young, indeed it is. When time moved on a bit, and it came out at a very bad time, and people were harshly critical of it, I think, in lots of cases, and it didn't do as well as he would have hoped, although it came out in quite a few languages. So I discussed the idea with his family, with whom I was in touch, of revisiting it for Dylan's 70th and making it the book that he'd wanted to publish. So I restored it, and it became, so I had the original Young Readers Start Here. I had the carbon copy of the manuscript. Remember those things? We used to have carbon copy you put in between. There were about 8 carbons, I think. So I had that, which he'd given me, and I had the scan of the published manuscript from 86. And I sat down and I merged them. I went and didn't put everything back. I put most of it back, but I kind of merged them. And sometimes it was merged, that was adding a few lines or a phrase that gave it a particular flavor. Because I think some of the character had gone for the book. And then there were whole chunks I put back, long interview with parents. Of course, the famous, the flight from Lincoln, Nebraska to Denver at the break of midnight, where they talked for that long freewheeling interview, which had been really cut about. And lots of stuff about the village. And I felt that was all crucial, because that was, first of all, no one but Shelton interviewed the parents. I know his mother appeared on the Rolling Thunder tour, but they weren't interviewed properly. Dylan talked very freely to Bob Shelton. Perhaps we should call him Robert to make it easier, too many Bobs in the story. And he did, you know, and he over, I mean, Robert over researched terribly, which was one of the why it got stalled. So he stuff about the White Goddess and about mythology and about Woodstock as an arts colony, and so it was a very big book. So I restored all that, and it was about 240,000 words, and I think it went down quite well, and it was sort of the text, I suppose, and it was all there. But it was very expensive to translate. Also, I have to say that edition you held up, while it looked quite nice, it was incredibly hard to read, quite small print with a very long measure. So it's still around. I think you can still buy it, and it is out there at least for people who want that. But anyway, then the publisher I was working with for the Joan book, talked about we talked on and off about revisiting it again, and he asked me if I could cut it to 100,000 words for an illustrated book, sort of aimed at younger readers who got into Dylan, in the sort of, in the 80s and 90s, and even in this century, I suppose, the kids. And also it would be more viable as a translation project. And I thought, I've got cut more than half. That's a huge, huge task. And I did much of it in New York this spring while I was there working on the village trip. And actually it was kind of, I'm expecting some brickbats. I took out the long chapter on Dylan and the academics because it seemed to me that after the Nobel, that battle has been won. I mean, some people would say that he doesn't deserve a Nobel. Okay, that's for them to say, but I didn't think we needed to go into the justification of whether he was a poet, which Shelton had done. And I took out all the album reviews, the track-by-track album reviews, which I always felt was like slowed it up somewhat, or a bit stilted. And then, so that took out a chunk of stuff and got me down to about 200,000 words, I think. And then I had to look at it really carefully. So I sort of thinned out all the stuff at the University of Minneapolis because there were endless eyewitness accounts. So I tried to give all the voices some kind of space in there, but not endlessly kind of go over every story. But the key bits, the parents again, the village years, the flight, all that's there. And actually, also what I took out actually were the long quotes from press conferences, because again, that stuff can be found. It's kind of, a lot of it's anthologized. You can find it online. You can find it in the 2011 edition. So that shortened it quite a bit. So to my amazement, I got it down to 105,000 words. And someone else did the last bit, and then I wrote a forward and afterword to bring it up. And just as I finished the afterword, of course, he released the new album, so I revisited that. But anyway, as we speak, actually, it's going to press. So, and it looks very nice illustration. So I hope the older Dylan fans, the likes of us, will appreciate what it is and won't just kind of tear it apart and feel that I've sort of crashed the Rosetta Stone. And I do hope that younger readers who don't have the patience for the long book or have never seen it will read it, because the fact is that Shelton was there. He was around. He was a witness to it. He wrote the 1961 review that is credited with launching Dylan's career. I think Susie would say that it did. Dylan probably would say that it did. Mm-hmm. So Shelton deserves his respect. And it's very evocative. The years in the village, now I know the village so well. It's incredibly evocative to read that. So I think it's important we have it as an eyewitness account. So it still ends basically in 1979 backstage at Earl's Court in London, and then sort of afterward just sort of, considers the years since. But there's no shortage of other biographies of Dylan, obviously, for people who want to know the more recent story. But I think that, that's the capturing of Dylan at a particular time. The formative years, if you like, is very important. So I hope it'll be out in March, April, and I hope, if life returns to some kind of normality next year, and if I can have my festival in Greenwich Village, I hope we can not only launch the book properly, but actually celebrate Shelton and his review from September 1961 at Gerdy's with some kind of event in the village. Because as Janice Ian said to me, Shelton was the father of rock journalism, really. He was writing in the New York Times. Rolling Stone didn't exist, the Village Voice. He was the only one doing it. So all the people who criticize him, they need to remember that he was doing something very original for the time.
And that, I guess that'll be the 60th anniversary.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing? Who'd have thought? I mean, I'm sure Shelton never thought that, and I'm sure Dylan didn't either. But you know, it's kind of, it's music and popular culture and history, but it's, you know, it's a culture. It's our cultural history. It's very important.
Definitely. So now you got into folk music as at a very young age. You write about that in the last leaf, the Joan Baez book. Do you want to share some of that right now with our viewers?
Yes, if you want. But tell me if I'm going on too long. Well, I'm, you know, it probably says it on the jacket. But I mean, I'm 63, so I was kind of young. I would have been young for the original kind of Dylan Baez, you know, when they first came out on the scene. And it was 1969, and I'd been given a beautiful blonde, genuinely Spanish guitar by my sister's boss. My sister had gone to Spain to work as a, you know, in the mid 60s, and she bought me back first of all a sort of half-size guitar, and then after Christmas I got this beautiful blonde real Spanish guitar, and I had to learn to play it. So I'd been doing piano for a while, and someone showed me, you know, half a dozen chords, you know, the usual kind of E, A, B7, all that kind of stuff, you know, and a couple of minors in sequences. So I realized that they were the key to a lot of songs. But there were, you know, there weren't so many guitar tutors then. There weren't, you know, the books you got from the library were much more I don't know whether you have it instead. There's a famous book called Play in a Day, Bert Weedon, which was the thing that all the Brits had, and which a lot of the rock and rollers learned from. But it wasn't what I wanted to do. And I was kind of looking through my sister's record collection. She was away, and I found this record with this black and white cover, and this young woman sitting with her arms folded in some dappled sunlight. It's called Joan Baez Volume 2. I had no idea who she was. So I turned it over, and on the back, she was pictured playing a Spanish guitar. So I thought, oh, this is hopeful. So I put it on the old gramophone that I'd inherited in my bedroom from my parents. And the first track, of course, was Unaccompanied Wagoner's Lad. And I wanted to name it. Then The Trees They Do Grow High, which was a bit too complicated for me at that stage. I had lots of bar chords, so I couldn't do that. But then there were things like Barbara Allen and Banks of the Ohio and Wildwood Flower and Plaisir de More, all of which I kind of knew because we had in Britain in the, I don't know when it started, 40s, 50s, probably 50s, 60s, and it went on into the 70s, I think, and Jarvis Cocker has written about it. We had this BBC broadcast, you know what the BBC is, the schools broadcast called Singing Together, which went out once a week, and sort of schools, primary schools across the land listened to it. And each kind of term, you know, it was a themed set of songs, so I guess it was an American thing. So a lot of the songs I knew, and also in Britain, unlike America, we had 4 official radio stations and 2 TV channels. So you had that business of family viewing. So you all sort of heard the same thing. So somewhere in my mind's ear, I knew these songs, so I began, you know, playing them. And then when I went to secondary school that summer, I found 2 more Baez's debut album and Joan Baez Volume 5 in the school library. So I kind of learned those, and then I found the Joan Baez songbook, you know, the actual physical songbook. So I was learning stuff, and then at some point, I think with Joan Baez Volume 5, which has this extraordinary track called Bachianas Brasileiras, which is by the Brazilian composer Villa-Lobos, and it's a fusion of sort of Johann Sebastian Bach and Brazilian folk song, aria for 8 cellos and soprano, and I thought, wow, that is some voice. I never tried to copy that, I hasten to add. And then I realized that, you know, as I read in those analog days, the kind of sleeve notes, which led me to other kind of musicians, obviously to Dylan quite quickly, you know, Judy Collins and Pete Seeger and Tom Paxton and all that kind of stuff. I began to kind of piece together this little history of the kind of 60s. And particularly, and she became a sort of Venn diagram through Baez, through which I explored not just the music with her records leading me, you know, laying out a path, but also more generally the kind of history of the 60s, and of course the civil rights. I mean, 1969, the March on Washington happened about 6 years previously. Martin Luther King was a year dead. So, you know, I'd heard of Martin Luther King. Obviously, I was 12 or whatever I was then, 11, 12. But, you know, I didn't really know what the March on Washington was. And I found the old Folkways record of that in Dobell, actually bought for me by a good friend, Dobell's record shop. And I listened to that, you know, the Martin Luther King speech, and Baez singing, and Dylan singing, and Mary, and all the rest of it. And I just began to explore you know, I got very hooked on the American 60s and civil rights movement and everything that had gone on. So, you know, that weaving together of the music and the social activism, which of course comes together in all these, you know, which is part of Dylan's story. And then I was just very obsessed, and I was obsessed with this by then, sort of 72, 73, when my classmates at school, of course, were screaming for David Cassidy and Donny Osmond and, you know, I don't know, basically whatever, you know, people were listening to. And I was going home and listening to Bison Dillon and Leonard Cohen and Judy Collins, Janis Ian, and it's, you know, that was 50 years ago, and there I am, still obsessed. You know, it still gives me great joy. You know, and I still find new things, and I think it's, you know, there's something very special about that singer-songwriter movement, whether it's just kind of a voice and a guitar or, you know, slightly more accompanied now. But it's very, you know, it's very special music. It moves me, I think, in a way that no other music does really still.
I can certainly relate to that.
Yeah.
So one of the many wonderful aspects about the book is that it is everything. It's about Joan Baez. It's from Joan Baez's point of view. One reason I point that out is that someone on social media pointed out that another Joan Baez book, or maybe it was one of her own books, was referred to as a Dylan reference book. And, you know, obviously she's quite accomplished in her own right in many ways, associated with Dr. Martin Luther King and so on. So that's, you know, it's one of the strengths of the book is to see everything from her point of view, or, you know, in a context that shows what she did and her reaction and her influence and her actions. And there's since I'm in Massachusetts, yeah, there's Joan went to Boston University, and so did Dr. Martin Luther King. And there's the whole Club 47 scene, and that from, yeah, I was also too young to be around at the time, but it seems like the Village and Cambridge were the places to go for folk musicians.
Yeah. Yeah, I so wish I could have been there for you too, probably.
So do you want to talk a little bit about her? You kind of already did this, but a little bit more about her childhood and how it influenced her social activism, and also and how she grew as she started performing, became, you know, she was a little bit more I know shy is the right word, but she wasn't very comfortable on stage at first, and
No.
you talked about a whole transition.
Yeah, I mean, I first saw her live in 1971, just for reference. You know, my parents took me; they wouldn't let me go by at the Rainbow Theatre in London, which was very exciting. And I didn't, you know, never occurred to me that I'd see her kind of multiple times in sort of 3 countries over the course of 50 years, 40 years, 50 years, whatever, 40 years. I can't do no 50 years. I can't do the maths.
Well, this year was 10 years. So.
20 plus, that's about 50 years. Okay.
Yeah.
So since I first saw her. So yeah, so I, you know, she had a fascinating family. I mean, she grew up peripatetic. Her father was much more than she ever let on, actually. Was a very distinguished scientist. He was Mexican, of course, hence the name. Who was co-inventor of the X-ray microscope and various other things that flowed from that. Her mother, of course, was born in Edinburgh, and I tracked down the birth certificate and so on. And her maternal grandfather was a Episcopalian minister at a very famous church on the western end of Princes Street in Edinburgh. And they left for Canada, I think, originally, and then into the States. They moved around a lot in the States. I mean, I traced the journey a bit. And of course, her paternal grandparents came from Pueblo in Mexico via Texas, and they settled in Brooklyn. So she had 2 sets of, you know, both grandparents were ministers. So her mother's father was an Episcopalian minister, and her father's father was born a Catholic, and he left the Catholic Church and become a Methodist Episcopalian minister. And she talks in Gulf Winds, a song about her father, how her own father had considered the church, but decided he wanted to be a scientist. So in fact, I did find the church in, there was a move to save the actual physical building, which is a particular Renaissance style building in Brooklyn, Carroll Gardens, which I read about last year when I was already researching the book. And I went out and found the church and sort of traced the route. And I found someone who, now 92, who remembered Mother B and Father B as they were called. And they were, the mother was very much part of the ministry, and they ran a camp for Hispanic summer kids up in the Walker Valley, and raised money to take children up. They wouldn't have otherwise had a holiday. So the church was, and he was an advocate of kind of the church as, the center, and very much part of community and helping people in a holistic fashion. And he was a great advocate for the Spanish-speaking community in sort of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So she kind of grew up with that on both sides. And then, as she's often talked about, of course, her father had a crisis of conscience over his science and whether it could be used for offensive or defensive purposes. And it was her mother who suggested they go to Quaker meeting. They were in Buffalo at that point. And it was at a Quaker meeting that Albert Byers sort of made peace with his conscience. And Joni and her two sisters also had to go along, didn't much like it, I don't think. But I think that grounding was obviously very important, because to some degree, I don't know whether she considers herself a Quaker still. I think she's still keeping a daily silence is very much a part of who she is. And certainly the Quaker youth movement was a very formative experience, because it was a conference in Monterey in 1958 that she first saw Martin Luther King speak and met him. So she grew up in this kind of, I suppose the Quakerism really is the Central American tradition of dissent, isn't it? So I think that was very formative. And then she felt an outsider, and having first acquired a ukulele and then a guitar, music was a way of kind of making connections and making friends. Especially since the family moved so much and it was quite difficult to hang on to friends, and there were lots of different schools and so on. The last move they made in 1958-59 was from California across to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where her father had a job that embraced various institutions in that area. And he famously took his wife and daughters to check out the coffee house scene in Cambridge, and they went to Tuller's Coffee Grinder, where she became, she looked at the guy playing his classical guitar under the yellow lamp, and she was hooked. And fairly soon, of course, she was playing at Club 47, which she really put on the map, I think, and then made her unannounced debut at the Newport Folk Festival, of course, in 1959 as a guest of Bob Gibson. And from that moment on, it was very, Robert Shelton was there from the New York Times and said that the star was born, signed to Vanguard, and she began this amazing career. And very early on, in first, you think of there was Joan Baez Volume 1 and Volume 2, and then there were the Abrasive in Concert records that followed. And they were recorded in the South, in the segregated South, but she insisted that the concert venues were black and white together. So she went to kind of places that were the way stations on the kind of battle for civil rights, Birmingham, Alabama, and Miles College and all the rest of it, and gave concerts. So she was, from the very beginning, she was very consistent. And I think now, I think for, back in the days when it was kind of peaceful, when the world was a bit nicer in the 80s and 90s particularly, I suppose we forgot how dangerous all that was. But I think the last few years have made it very clear again how difficult it must have been, and how scary it must have been to be in the South, the Deep South, in those days when, Bull Connor, put the hoses on the kids and set the police dogs out, and, the Birmingham church Sunday school bombing and all the rest of it. So she was very consistent from the get-go. And it is fascinating to think that she was also, as she said, she was very, very uncomfortable on stage, that she was very anxious and so on. It wasn't until basically the second half of her career where she began to feel comfortable. And I think you can see that, or I can see that when you see her perform. And of course, very quickly, by the time of those in concert albums, she's also this young, scruffy folk singer called Bob Dylan. So she's already recording with God Inside and Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, and so on. So from, right from the start, there's this social activism, and then the mentoring and the discovering of young singer-songwriting talent. And of course, she brought Dylan on stage at many concerts, Newport 63, obviously, but then, tours 63, 64. Of the Northeast particularly, but some of the West Coast too.
And that, yeah, and again, we save some of it for people to buy the book. We don't want to tell all the Bob Dylan stories, but it's a very as reading the book, it's just so the framing of it is one of the things I enjoy the best, with just seeing everything in the context, great detail, and definitely recommend it to everyone watching right now.
Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to do, it's not a kiss and tell. I mean, she's told quite a bit about her own life in And a Voice to Sing particularly, but it's a book that puts her musical and social activism in context, and it shows how it links very specifically with everything else, not just with Dylan. So you can see her as part of a pattern, because I do think that the whole 1960s, 70s period was incredibly significant, not just musically, but socially, politically, youth finding its voice, the battles fought that we all thought were won until Trump came along, and until we had our own little local difficulties, of course, which was mirror yours. So, and I've also tried to show that she really matters, because there are a lot of Dylan fans who think she rode on his coattails, and that's absolutely not true. I mean, he has said more recently that her voice was like a siren from some Greek island, and she'd been on television. She'd had her face on the cover of Time magazine when before Dylan hit New York. So she was a very influential figure, and of course she was huge influence on other women coming through. But she was a key part of Dylan's life, and she did give him a ready-made platform. It's not to say he wouldn't have come to fame without her, and she would never say that, and no one else has ever said that, I don't think. But she was very crucial, and that it was a very, I think we'd have both liked to have been there. That scene, particularly New York and other campuses, but New York and Boston, Cambridge, were very, very important and influential scenes, and some fantastic music came out of it, which we still listen to today. And but she really matters, and that's so I've tried to show that she's what a good that she has a fantastic God-given voice. She was no slouch as a guitarist. When you listen to her playing, I mean, she's a very nifty guitarist. I think very, I say that as someone who's, I tried to learn lots of guitar parts, but I say that as someone who did do music quite seriously, and you can hear the way she structures her playing. I think she's a very, very good musician, and all that is just allied to this, absolute social conscience and this desire to champion the right causes, and to do brave things. And I think there's no separating the music from the social activism. I think they came together in her, and folk music has, of course, has always been allied with the kind of the left. Not that she thinks in terms of left and right, but it's always been allied with sort of righteous causes.
The right and wrong, I think, is more like it.
Right and wrong, yeah, that's right. So she used her music really well to bring people together, and every movement worth its name has music as part of it.
I just had two thoughts. First of all, when I was reading about in your book about bringing Bob Dylan on stage to a Joan Baez concert, it was just kind of reminded me of John Lennon bringing Yoko Ono to a concert or something. I'm a big fan of Yoko, but it was like it's not necessarily the same type of music that they're known for, and that was a brave thing in a different way.
Yes, it was, because lots of people wanted to hear the pure soprano. They didn't want to hear this raucous minstrel that she found somewhere.
And the other thing is, and I didn't even think about this, but in 1969 was the year I moved past like the Beatles and the Monkees, and I got a better record player and an allowance and a transistor radio, so I was listening to AM radio a lot. And I believe 1969 was The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down was a single. I didn't know anything about it. I just
71, yeah.
And I just bought it because like a lot of things, it didn't matter if it was country or soul or anything. I would just buy, it cost 69 cents plus tax, and I would just buy it. And it was like 5 years later, I was about to see Dylan and the band, and I didn't even know that much about Dylan. I knew almost nothing about the band, and the local radio station was doing a little pre-show, just playing music by Dylan and the band, and they played the band's version of "The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down," and I didn't know it was a song by the band, so I got my single and I said J.R. Robertson for the song. I read the labels all the time anyway, and that must be that Robbie Robertson guy. And
yeah, I think I did much.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that was I believe went to #1. It was a huge hit, and
that was her really big hit. Yeah, I mean, she continued to sing it right to the end. I mean, of course, and then the year or so since she's retired from the stage, of course, it's become rather controversial song, I suppose. So it'll be interesting to know how she thinks about it now.
Yeah, it was making controversy out of nothing. It's not, that's a lot of people do. There's a lot of real problems in the world.
Yeah. Well, I think at the time they said, "Are you trying to help the South from rising?" Yeah, I think, which I guess Robertson had the same question.
I actually met Joan Baez once in 1985. I was I working in a record store in Framingham, Massachusetts, and in comes Joan Baez and two young men. One of them was named Gabriel, and she was it was more like an indie punk kind of store in a mall. I don't know how she even found it, but anyway, she came in, and I sold her the "We Are the World" cassette that she later sang to the world. and I took an out-of-state check. I figured it was okay. That was my brush with greatness there.
So did you chat with her? Did you say you're Joan? But you talked to her as...
Yeah, I tried to be cool. I actually had in behind the counter, I had the advanced copy of the new Bob Dylan Empire Burlesque album. I thought it's probably not a good idea to play it. I wasn't sure if it was a good idea or a bad idea. And I just, I didn't want to bug her. I figured she made some comment about the people on the album being like the new voice of protest kind of thing. Is Springsteen on that one? Yeah, I think Springsteen. I think she said something about Bruce Springsteen. Just in passing, and I just I just tried to be cool, but it's
I guess her son was at school not far away, wasn't he? Probably.
I have no idea, but but that was it's like, should I ask for an autograph? You got to be cool, so I left her alone. But
so I know. I always think there are lots of times I wish I'd been cool when I was growing up.
I'm sorry, I think we lost you for a second there.
So I was going to say, lots of times I have to look back on my life, various bits of my life now. I think, why was I so cool? I should have just asked, the people I've met, asked for a picture or asked for an autograph. But,
so what have your been interactions with Joan Baez been like?
Well, I met her after I first saw her in concert, December '71. My parents were patient enough to wait outside the stage door for me to get an autograph in the kind of wet December night. And then I first sort of met her properly, actually, with Shelton in 1980. She was here to record the Muppet Show in London. And she gave a press conference. It was about the time of the campaign to rescue the boat people, remember? So there was a press conference, and I met her, and Shelton introduced me properly, and I think I asked a question or two. And then I did a press call for at Greenham Common when we were all protesting against the Reagan's warheads being positioned there. That was '84, I think, and I interviewed her a few times around then. So I've I interviewed her at various stages through the '80s and '90s, and then I saw her in 2018. We chatted as well, and I suppose the most exciting thing I got. During all the time I was trying to write about her, she was very unfashionable. It was Joan who? What? Who cares? All that stuff. And I was, I thought then she really mattered, and I wanted to write about her. So I did a few times, but it was quite difficult to place anything. Folk music magazines took stuff, and then Mojo, to whom I was writing a bit freelance in the '90s, they kind of rang me. I was just doing my regular day job, and they called me and said, "Do you want to do you want to go report on Joan Baez recording a new album? So I said, yeah, of course I do. And it's in New York, next week. So I had to kind of abscond from my job. I mean, I said where I was going, but it was a bit short notice. So I was flown to New York with 3 other journalists, and I went to the first 2 of the 4 sessions at the Bottom Line in Greenwich Village. The Bottom Line is sadly no longer there, of course. For the album,
great venue, yeah.
Bring Them, it was fantastic. Bring Them Bells. So Janice Ian, Mary Chapin Carpenter, the Indigo. No, I didn't see the Indigo Girls. The first 2. I've been up half the night watching them actually. So I haven't seen a moment. Mary Black. So it was so incredibly exciting, and I watched the rehearsals for the second day, which was nice. I said, asked the manager, because I can't remember seeing them by the time. He said, yeah, okay. So I watched the rehearsal with Janice Ian and Mary Black. And that was incredibly exciting. Sort of the spring sunshine in the village, and I pitched it, and it was Joe kind of doing it, organising a coffee round actually when I walked in. So, and then they set to work, and it was just the fun of really high level musicians just making great music, just messing around and trying things and so on. So that was a really exciting encounter, and I think I've interviewed her formally about 6 or 7 times down the years, including a very long interview in 1990, I guess, when she just put out an album called Speaking of Dreams, which is one of 3 kind of indie albums she did in like 1980s to 90s, which kind of sank without trace at the time because it was a small label called Gold Castle, produced by Alan Abrahams, and showing her voice actually at its mid-80s best. And so, she was here to promote it, and I went to see her, and we had quite a long chat over afternoon tea. And she said, it occurred to me after I'd done this album that if I didn't pay attention to a bit of promotion and marketing, which is going to sink without trace, because she'd been sort of labelless really for much of the 80s. And she said, it's also occurred to me that I'm not going to have this voice forever, and I'd quite like to bow out at a time of my choosing and not just fizzle out. So, she said, I've hired a manager, and indeed Mark came down, and I was introduced to him. So she was putting music on the front of her life, really for the first time, because it had always taken second place to her some social political action. And, the wall had come down the previous year, Berlin Wall and the rest of it, in Prague, Havel was in power. So it was that brief period of time, when everything seemed hunky-dory, we were all going to be okay. So I suppose she felt that she could find its firelight and go off and make music. And she said, then I reminded her a couple of years ago, she said, I've probably got, since 1990, right, she said, I've probably got another 10 years of, being able to do this. So, I'd like to. So, and of course, as it turned out, she was at midpoint of her career, which was really interesting. So, she had 30 years ahead of her, basically. So that was, that was really interesting. So we talked in some detail then about all kinds of things, including whether she would ever record a classical album, which I always hoped she might. But she didn't. Well, there may be stuff in the can somewhere. So that was a really nice encounter, because she talked very frankly and in depth, about plans and what's happened before and what she hoped would happen and various thoughts. So that was a really interesting encounter, and she was quite relaxed and so pleased that she had this plan. Because then immediately, having said she was going to give up doing all the politics, she went off and she went to Sarajevo during the siege. So so she never really, of course, she never left it behind. But she did, I think, as in the last couple of decades of her career, the kind of the heavy political commentary which characterized her concerts, which I kind of liked, was often replaced by just judiciously chosen songs. So on the farewell tour, I think every concert I saw, she sang Woody Guthrie's Deportee, and so all she had to say was, we shouldn't be building wall, we should be feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and then she just go into Deportee. Or from her last album, of course, that wonderful song the President sang, Amazing Grace, which is terrific. Zoe Melford, just been recorded by the Kronos Quartet, it's been released, hasn't it? But on the last bit of the tour in New York and in Spain, I think, where I saw her, excuse me, she also sang Birmingham Sunday, which was, as people may remember, was the song that her brother-in-law Richard Farini wrote about the 1963 Birmingham church bombing in which 4 little girls died. And it was very chilling to hear those two songs together, separated by, I can't do the maths again, but, 3 decades or so, but the same tragic issues.
Not to bring everything back to Bob Dylan, although that's what I'm known for. I was thinking in 1991, they gave Dylan a Lifetime Achievement Award and the Grammys, and the next year they had that 30th year anniversary celebration thing. And what was that, 28 years ago?
Yeah,
Still going.
yeah.
I guess the idea of like being over 30 and being a musician was something people couldn't even fathom back when we were kids.
Yeah, well, I mean, it must be extraordinary. I mean, obviously Dylan will play on, I assume, until, like the old bluesman, to his last breath, I guess, assuming he's able, assuming we can all get back to playing on and going back to concerts. It's easier for guys, of course, because, he had a different voice, and, it's a very different voice now from the one he originally had, but it's easier for men, by and large, to sing on. Obviously, Joan felt that, actually, I love the late voice. I think it's really, the voice of Whistle Down the Wind, I think it's a fantastic instrument. But she said it, needed a lot of work to maintain it, which I'm sure it does, because gravity, and as with everything else, it takes over. And the vocal was changed, so she decided she'd do something else. But all these people have, all of them to some degree, including Tom Paxton, who's left us some great songs. They may not be as high profile, but they've all left us this amazing legacy of music. And Dylan and Byers, I think Janice Ian said to me that Woody and Pete were the fulcrums of that generation, and then it's Dylan and Byers, the latest generation, which I think is true.
So what did you think of the Martin Scorsese Rolling Thunder film story?
I really liked it. I mean, I remember, as you probably did, I remember going to see Ronaldo and Clara with great excitement, being somewhat bewildered by it, but loving the music, absolutely loving the music footage. I think I have a copy of it somewhere. And I hope there'd be, there is a lot of music in the recent Scorsese. I hope there'd be more, or perhaps I hope there'd be more Byers and Dylan. It's a great movie. Did you ever see them sing together? I'd have loved to have heard them together.
I went to the night of the hurricane in 1975 at Madison Square Garden.
Did you?
Yeah.
That must have been very special.
Yes, it was. I'm not going to talk about it too quickly, but as like I said, the previous year when I saw Dylan in the band was when I became obsessed, and then it was less than 2 years later. It was on my birthday, and you can only get tickets in Madison Square Garden, and I'm. As people my age say, well, there was no internet back then. So basically I had the FM radio on like all the time, waiting for something. I couldn't even drive at night at that age, and waiting for, what if he plays around here? How am I going to get a ticket and all that? And they just had the New York Times, and I said, can I take off school and take the train in? And I got a pair of tickets, last row on the side. And I couldn't even stay to the very end because I went with my sister, and it was like if I didn't get the 12:30 train, it would be like the 3:30 train, and we were just like teenagers. But but it was it was it was just unbelievable. And Joan was great. Seeing Joan live, her voice is I'd seen the Woodstock film, and I knew and I had several records, but just seeing her live is just such a treat to hear that voice.
She's a very charismatic performer, but that was the night, of course, where she dressed up as Dylan, I think, wasn't it? She put on the white on. But those shots, which was in Ronaldo and Clara, those really close, static mic, the static shot, and you just see them both kind of coming in and out of the mic while they do Never Let Me Go. Absolutely fantastic. I kind of had sense chills down my spine. Must have been, I had walked a million miles. I was a student in Liverpool at this time, and I remember reading about it in papers. And oh God, I'd so like to have seen that. And the first time I saw Dylan, in fact, was 1978, because of course he came to the UK for the Isle of Wight in 1969, and he didn't play here again until 1978. And I was doing the first part of my finals. You have to go and wait in line somewhere. And in fact, while I was sniffing out where you had to wait in line for the night, someone came out and said he was going to be selling the tickets and I wanted some early. And I kind of crazily, I handed over a whole week's money for 2 tickets. All he wanted me to do was buy a coach ticket so that I could come to London from Liverpool. So I handed him I can't remember, £30, which was a lot of money in 1978, you know. And then, of course, I spent the whole weekend when I was supposed to be revising thinking, I've just given this guy, you know, £30 and I'm not in the line for tickets and I'm not going to get the tickets. You know, he's obviously just going to make off with my money. But in fact, I did get the tickets and I saw him at Earl's Court Saturday the 17th of June 1978, and then at Blackbush, which was the kind of the outdoor event at the airport.
To meet the demand, right? They had that huge show.
Yeah. And they were both, I mean, a lot of people thought that was too polished and refined. I mean, I loved and some of the musicians had been on the Rolling Thunder tour. I just thought those concerts were just fantastic. The sound, even at Earl's Court, was really good. And then I remember when I went back to university following my last year in September 78, I spent another whole load of money on the Japanese import of Budokan album, Probe Records in Liverpool, which I think is still there actually. I mean, get high and hot just walking up the steps. In the Cavern Quarters has now been rebranded. So I mean, that album is I still have the vinyl pressing. It's such a good album. But I just love to have seen them together. You know, when I first eventually got my hands on the Newport 1963 album together with Guy, you know, and when you see footage of them, I think it's it's very extraordinary, very extraordinary.
Yeah,
must
definitely.
Have been, those people you saw in the 60s together must have been just amazing. I'm so envious.
Yeah, there's always that spark when you're looking at each other. There's always that spark, no matter what's going on, except maybe on Don't Look Back. But the rest of the time, there's a lot of different type of sparks, maybe.
Different kind of sparks, yeah. But it is interesting because you can see her really, you know, watching him the whole time because, of course, you never know what he's going to do, and she's always kind of taking cues. I mean, she's an incredible musician. I think. I mean, he's a great musician, but she's a great musician in a different sense. I mean, I think it's interesting. She chose to study drama. You know, when her family pitched up in Cambridge, she'd been accepted to study drama at Boston University. I don't think she had any particular interest in drama, which is where she met Betsy Siggins, of course, and that crew, and got into folk music. But I always think, and I did ask her, you know, that probably had she wanted to apply to study opera somewhere, I'm sure she would have been accepted because she had a truly amazing voice. And she said, when we discussed it last time, she said, well, I wanted to keep my feet in the dirt of folk music. But I always think it would have been nice to have heard, you know, to have heard her do some more classical stuff, but you know, we didn't.
So we'll get back to Joan in the present day. So she's done these series of paintings, and it's like RBG, Dr. King, Dr. Fauci, the next vice president, we hope, Kamala Harris, John Lewis, Emma Gonzalez. So I was wondering what you think, because I think people who had our upbringing, that stuff really resonates, but we're already it's not going to convince us of anything new. I was just wondering what your thoughts are about the place of artists in this day and age, and when they make political statements, you know, celebrities and so on. And it's a very different world than back then.
Well, it is. I mean, I think, especially in America in the South in the 60s, those people who really stepped out, and also against the Vietnam War, which was not became a kind of a great cause, but it was in the mid 60s when Byers was first speaking out against it. You know, they were brave, and you know, they were, you know, the South was dangerous, obviously. I mean, you know, you read Harry Belafonte's memoir, and he flew in with $50,000 in cash, I think, because the civil rights movement needed money for voter registration. I think that's something, and they all did really brave things. So it wasn't just a question of popping up to lend your voice on this or that record, or, I mean, it was great that Lady Gaga turned out for Biden, the Biden campaign. But that's the easy bit. It's the lifetime of commitment that I think is impressive. And there, you know, of course, there are artists that still do that, and they organize. I think Springsteen was fantastic after 9/11 and done other stuff. For example, you know, there are people that do, you know, that's not to deny there are people who do really significant things. But that sense of living a life, as Pete Seeger did, you know, of doing good, which sounds very pious, but, you know, doing good things and putting your putting your voice and career, as Baez absolutely did, at the service of others. I mean, she took, you know, I think she really is an example of someone who's used her gifts to bring music and hope to people who didn't have much of either. I mean, if you think of her going to Latin America in the very early 80s, and the kind of high watermark of all those, you know, hideous Latin American dictators that was supported by, you know, Nixon and then Reagan and so on, you know, bomb threats and so on. I mean, that was brave stuff there. And then, you know, kind of smuggling Václav Havel into a concert in Prague when he had only been just released from prison. You know, she really did sort of creative things to kind of emphasize the point. And indeed, you know, it was Soros who organized for her to, I think she was the first artist into Sarajevo, you know, and there's footage of her kind of in her flak jacket, wandering the streets and meeting the church of Sarajevo, and then giving this open air concert in a square somewhere. So she really is an example of using, you know, using the power of your gift, music in her case, for the greater good. And she's obviously now trying to do that with her painting. And who knows, she may pop up doing the odd song somewhere or backing vocal. Be interesting to see. I think, you know, I think she's not been. She's had the Woody Guthrie Award quite recently, and she's been given some award from Prague, I think, just a couple of weeks ago. But you know, she deserves. I mean, I always wonder why she hasn't been given a sort of Kennedy honor or something. She deserves a real acknowledgement of a lifetime of service. Sounds very pious, but you know, she's done good, and she's raised a lot of money and done good things discreetly for people. I think, you know, small acts of kindness as well as the kind of grander things she's done. Very instrumental in getting Amnesty International started on the West Coast. So she's a real example of a musician and activist who's, you know, it's not just about recording the hit single. And the fact that she wasn't invited to take part in the We Are the World sessions, I think, is pretty terrible omission. She was given the opening spot at Live Aid in Philadelphia, but she had 7 minutes. But you know, she's a real example, which is why people need to know her story, because she counts. You know, people endlessly say, Joan who? What? You know, and so I used to get very cross because I think it's a significant. Hers is a very significant contribution.
Right, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that, I mean, she did sacrifice a potentially very high-profile music career to do things that are really help people in a direct way, sacrificing that and giving up, you know, all sorts of money and fame and everything for something that is a true passion, and it's not something that she just does because it is fashionable, you know. So
exactly.
So one of the things about the book is, I said, it puts that all in context. As you said, it's not even a telebook. I didn't even think about that aspect when I was reading about it. It just flows as a narrative that tells her story, the important things in her life, and her reaction to things, and how, from her perspective of the things that she witnessed. And as I said, you know, it's available, and everyone should pick it up. I want to ask you about the Village Strip Festival. Can you tell me about that?
Well, you know, I suppose as I told Joan actually last time I saw her properly, I said to her, it's your fault that I've got this really expensive project in New York. She sort of raised an eyebrow, and I said, well, you know, you remember that crummy hotel in Washington Square? She said, yeah, they fixed it up. So I said, yeah. So I said, they're my partner in the project. So it actually came out of doing the Shelton book first time round, because I've been doing my publishing gig, as you know, once a year, going to New York and staying in the Village. And I befriended the family. The Cromie Hotel over Washington Square, which was, of course, the Hotel Earl, as every Dylan fan will know, is now the Washington Square Hotel. It's been a family business since 1973. Lovely boutique hotel with great history. California Dreaming was also written there, as was Chestnut Mare, and I mean, all kinds of people stayed. It's got the most fantastic history. And the mum and dad and daughter and son-in-law who ran it, the pop's now no longer with us, sadly. You know, I came to know them all and taken friends and family there and sent friends and family there. So, you know, I got to know, I was there doing my publishing thing, and I got to know the Village really well. And, you know, it was the first few times I, oh my God, this is where Gertie's was, and this is what, you know. So then the time came when I was doing Shelton's book, and I was, when I'd read it the first time, I hadn't been to the village, and there was a bit where he talked about, this is the origin of the idea. He talked about, I can't remember the two clubs, something being a mile or two away from Gerdy's, and I thought, a mile or two, it's about 3 blocks. What's he talking about? So I corrected that, and as I was doing it, I thought, actually, isn't that amazing? All this stuff came from these, just really a very few blocks of real estate around Washington Square Park. All these people, all this music, and I knew then that it wasn't just the music, folk jazz, but it was also lots of women's rights, plus civil rights stuff, birth control, all that opening scene in the movie Reds, where they all spill out into Washington Square, and all that kind of revolutionary stuff in the 1900s. The village had been at the center of that for ages, and Eugene O'Neill, who was part of the Red Scene, was down there, writing a long day's journey in the night, and the Iceman comes and all the rest of it. And so I thought, wouldn't it, having sort of funk this thought during Shelton's book, I thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if you had a festival celebrating all this? Then immediately I thought, and you call it bringing it all back home to Washington Square, which was to be a vague nod to Henry James, of course, who was also there. And, I sort of wrote it down and talked to a few people who thought I was nuts, quite correctly, I suppose. And then I mentioned it to Janice Ian, and she said, wow, that's such a great idea, I'll play, if I can. So, I sort of kicked the idea, and I thought it would be easy, actually. Such a good idea. People would just be fighting to help me produce this concert in Washington Square Park. So the first thing is, of course, that, actually it's quite difficult to do a concert in the park because it's a kind of public space and you can't close it, and you can't charge people to come in. And, I sort of talked about it for ages, because if it was Britain, actually, we would have a festival celebrating, all that came out of the village. I mean, I know you have lots of festivals in the States, but we would, we're good at things like Shakespeare Country, Du Maurier Country, where we celebrate all the stuff. We would have an urban festival. So it puzzled me that there'd never been one, and I sort of talked about it endlessly with Judy and Mark and Rita and Dan, my parents. And eventually, they said, okay, if you want to have a go at this, we'll support you. You can stay at a hotel, that's our contribution. You can have your business meetings here, and we'll be the base for artists. That's great. So I started sort of cautiously going back and forth, and constrained at first because I had an elderly dad to look after. But I sort of started making plans and making calls. So what started as just a kind of one-off festival to celebrate essentially the folk revival became, partly Janice Ian said, make it annual. So I thought, oh, it's cool. Yeah, I'll make it annual. So a festival not just to celebrate the music, but to celebrate the history and heritage of the village. So the music, the politics, poetry, the drama, the people who were there, and everyone was there, and it's such a rich history. And of course the art and architecture, of the place itself, the bits that have been torn down. So I kind of ran around and tried to put together some coalition of the willing, and people gave me time, and quite a lot of people said, well, that's ambitious, thinking, but I persisted, and I got a few people to say, okay, if you can do an X and Y, we'll support you, and if you do X and Y, we'll connect you to this. So eventually in 2018, I thought, okay, I'm not going to rest until I have a go. So, I had to kind of figure out how I was going to do it on very little money, enough money to kind of show my commitment, but not to break my piggy bank, and then I raised a bit of money. So the first year, 2018, we had Suzanne Vega headlining a concert in Washington Square Park, which we do call Bringing It All Back Home to Washington Square. And we celebrated Eugene O'Neill and Jack Kerouac and Edna St. Vincent Millay. And who else did we do that first year? Jazz. We did a great, fantastic jazz event with the new schools. I got on board as a partner. And I got the great David Amram, who I very, very cautiously went to see at Cornelia Street Cafe, now sadly gone. I gave him an actual letter. Mr. Amram, I want to organise this festival. And he said, I'll play. Straight away, it was 11 o'clock, he'd done his gig, and he said, I'll play. So I said, but you don't know when it is. He said, I'll play. So I said, but I can't pay you much, but I'll play. So I said, okay, that's really nice, but you better have a think about it. So I gave him the letter, and by the time I awoke the next morning, he finished his, he's going to be 90 in 2 weeks' time. He'd finished his gig, he'd had dinner with a friend, and then he'd driven back to Beacon, New York State, And about 7:30 in the morning, he sent me this long email saying, "I've waited all my life. I want to do this. It's a fantastic idea. I'll play this. And how about we do my sweet, remembering, Greenwich Village portraits, in which I celebrate Kerouac and Odetta and Frank McCourt, and we can do this. And have you thought about asking so-and-so?" So he came. He was just amazing. He was the spirit of the festival. He was artist in residence the first year. I paid him a bit of money and put him up at the Washington Square Hotel, which he was thrilled with. And he jammed with students. It was just fantastic. And then I said, "What about, how about being artist emeritus?" So he came back in year 2 when Steve Earle headlined the main concert. And I, to kind of, I bought him I went to Gap and bought him a black bomber jacket, and went down to Chinatown, and I had it embroidered with the logo of the village trip on the back, and David Amram, artist in residence. He was thrilled. And I had Rita, who's the mum at the hotel, painted a portrait for him with all his kind of turquoise and jewels hanging around him. And he played again. We premiered actually a piece that he'd written. And so, so that was fantastic. So year 3, which was meant to happen in September, I had all sorts of plans. We were going to celebrate 100 years of women getting the vote, all this kind of stuff. And I came back in February with terrific plans, as I thought, for, this year. And of course it became, I hung on to the hope that I could do something. And then about July, I realized this wasn't really possible, so I've had to abandon it. So my plan is to come back as soon as I can, and I hope we can. I just hope the clubs survive. It's very difficult for musicians and excuse me. I had people like David Massengill play both years, and Diana Jones, Martha Redbone. I had lots of people playing, and we did 2 fantastic hootenannies at the bitter end both years, which became as a fixture. Last year we celebrated Izzy Young's life. So I'd quite like to put, if I can actually, before I come back, I'd quite like to try and record something on stage at the bitter end, put someone on stage there and stream it, partly as a fundraiser, partly as a promotion for the village trip. So I hope we'll come back. And in fact, I have a rather wonderful recording of the first hootenanny, which I had cleaned up by Steve Rosenthal, and everyone kindly gave me the rights. It was Tom Chapin, the Chapin sisters, and David Massengill, and David Amram, and who else played that year? Diana Jones and someone else, I think. But anyway, they all played. So we have this rather good tape from 2018, which I think I'm going to take recording, which I think I'm going to make available soon as a digital download at a modest price, and we can raise a bit of money for the festival and for the club up to the bitter end, I hope. Because, if those places don't survive, and if the spirit of it's about celebrating the village trip is about celebrating the people, who made the village, but it's also about trying to celebrate the spirit and preserve the village. It's not just a place where you go to have designer food or do designer shopping in Soho. It's a place, you should know, this is where Hendrix recorded, this is where Dylan first sang, this is where Edward Hopper painted, this is where Paul Robes, there are all these fantastic touchstones there. And that's what I'm trying to celebrate. So I'm very keen to have volunteers and people, anyone interested with ideas, and of course, certainly if anyone wants to help raise money or donate money, that's great, because it's been done mostly by me, getting in whatever money I can. And I hope it will be a proper 501c3 by next year. But without my getting hooked on Joan and then Dylan, there would be no village trip. So that's I suppose it's some fandom taken to a fairly extreme conclusion. But I do the village is I'm sure it's a remarkable. However many, not very many square miles, it's a pretty small area, but it's rich in history. And it mustn't just become another outdoor shopping mall or a bit of real estate. We have to remember what happened there, just as in Concord or wherever else in Massachusetts, you celebrate the history of a very different history, but it's still very important history.
Well, it sounds awesome. Hopefully next year, the 60th anniversary of Robert Shelton's review.
I hope so. One thing I plan to do this year, which maybe we'll do next year, we're going to do a celebration of Phil Oakes, and I plan to start in Far Rockaway, where he spent his last days and some parts of his early life, and then come into the village, probably on the A train, and do a whole thing. So I hope we'll revisit Phil, because Phil Oakes, Never for Fortune, of course, is one of his most famous songs. which Joan sang. But I mean, another very significant figure, and those Phil Oaks. I was standing in the Metropolitan in MoMA actually last year, and suddenly from the gift shop below came sound of Phil Oaks. I thought they were just playing one of the songs. That song about voting, I forgot what it's called. Up all night, but you think, wow, this stuff is never dated. We still need it, so cherish it, and we must, just as visual art gets passed down, we need, kids today need to hear this stuff and realize that how what this means and how important it was in its day and today.
So all right, so finishing up. So has Joan read your book? Has she got any feedback from it? Does she have a copy? Does she know you wrote a book?
I sent her a copy. Well, when I last saw her, I saw her in Boston actually last year at the celebration of Club 47 Passim. And when I interviewed her before that, I hadn't been commissioned to write the book. It was a sudden commission, which I was thrilled about. I would have liked to write a kind of longer book, but I was very pleased by the commission. So I wrote to her, and in closing the interview, I'd written as a result of our encounter. And I said, I'm thrilled to have been asked to write a biography, and this is the series, and this is the publisher, and so on, and great, and I look forward to seeing you in New York next month, or whatever it was. And I thought, well, I haven't asked her permission, I didn't ask her to do anything, or give me anything. But I thought if she wants to object, she knows where to find me now. So I didn't hear anything, so I thought, well, that's kind of good. So I kind of assumed she got the letter because I sent it to her office with a covering note for her assistant, and in fact, I was then in touch. One of the people I was in touch with Mitch Greenhill, singer in his own right, but Manny Greenhill's son. And we'd had a bit of an email, and then he was passing through London, and we met for coffee. And the first thing he said to me was, I called Mark Spector, who's Joan's current manager, to ask if they knew about the book, and they said they did. And was it okay if I talked? And they said, yes, it's fine if you want to talk. So I thought, oh, well, that's okay, because it felt like a bit of a benediction. They weren't stopping anyone talking. And there were other people, including Betsy Stiggins and Alan Abrahams, the producer, who I talked to, and then people like Janice Ian and so on. But I didn't ask Joan for anything at any stage. But I did quite late on, and I was sort of going to press as the world shut down. And I emailed her gallery in California to find out if they had a poster I could use advertising her first art show. And they said, no, we don't actually, but I guess you could use a painting. So I said, well, so by email, I said, well, that'd be very nice, but this isn't a big budget book. So I said, well, it's okay. So she said she'd asked Joan who she was seeing. So I thought, well, that's exciting. And then it all went silent for a few weeks. So I thought, and then a few weeks later, she got in touch and reminded me, what was it? I'm saying, Joan, what was it? What's the project? So I told her. So a few days later, she came back and said, well, Joan has a new self-portrait. So that's what's on the back jacket. So I'm very clear, I'm not making any claims about it. I'm not, I'm about, this is not an authorized biography. I didn't ask her to authorize it. I don't want to, I'm not making any self-aggrandizing claims, but I was touched to be offered the painting. So I hope when she gets the book, or when she got it, that, I hope she thinks it's okay. I'm sure she'll disagree with some judgments, and that's okay. But, I hope she feels it's a intelligent and fair assessment.
Fair and well researched, yes. And
yeah, I hope so. I mean, that's as much as you can hope for. I've had some very nice reviews actually here in the UK. So I'm hoping there'll be some nice American reviews too. But as I say, it's she's not been that much written about really. One French, one German biography, I think, both quite old. But that's it really. So there's a lot about Dylan, as we've said. Mm-hmm. So about time there's something on her, I think.
Yep. But in the context of Joan Baez, it's about Joan Baez, and which is what I like about it. It's Joan Baez's effect, as opposed to a Bob Dylan story. It's definitely Joan Baez's story, which is one of the strengths.
Yeah.
and Martin Luther King and all sorts of people. All
Yeah.
right, so you got the Shelton book coming out in the spring, you think?
Yes, I mean, it's about, I've had a couple of queries on it from the American publisher, but it's literally about to go to press. I think it will print in China. So the plan is that it'll be out in March, April. I'm not quite sure what date. And I suppose that depends a bit on events that are beyond our control, but certainly in time for Dylan's 80th birthday. And it's a large format illustrated book. And, you know, it's not, you know, it's absolutely all Shelton's words, and I haven't changed anything. I've just cut it so it's less detailed, less unwieldy, easier to read. And I hope that kind of people who know the book and you know, who've grown up with Dylan will appreciate it. But I also hope that younger people who discovered Dylan perhaps through downloads, or who, you know, discovered them in their parents' or their grandparents' record collection, and want to know a bit more about this guy and where he sits in the great scheme of things, or perhaps have read about Nobel, or who are growing up in, you know, some far-flung corner of the world. I hope it'll reach those people who will realize what an important figure Dylan is, and how much, you know, how important that whole era was, you know, the 60s and everything that flowed from it in terms of singer-songwriters. So I hope, you know, I'm sure there will be people who don't like it, inevitably, but, you know, I look forward to hearing what you think. I've tried to make it, you know, into a much more digestible and easily, you know, book that's easier to appreciate if you're not a total obsessive, you know. Because not
I don't know any people like that, really, total obsessive Bob Dylan fan.
Oh, well, I know lots of obsessives too, but you know, one has to, there are people who aren't quite so obsessive out there.
Yeah. All right. And any other things to look forward to at this time, or?
No, I don't know. Well, I'm Betsy Siggins, of who we were speaking, who's known to many of the folks here, and has asked me to help her make her memoirs a reality. So I've got some interviews with her, someone else has done, which I'm going to work with, and we're just trying to work out how best to do it, because she has an interesting history that plays into the Pilgrim Fathers history and so on. You know, the family's been in Massachusetts for a long time, but also, of course, the music history. But she's also done lots of other things. You know, she ran a soup kitchen in New York during the height of the AIDS crisis. So she's an interesting figure in her own right. So my plan is that I'm going to help her tell her story. Possibly, if you know, we'll see, for an American publisher. I think her archive is at the University of Massachusetts. So again, that's a story that needs, you know, I mean, it's been partially told in Baby Let Me Follow You Down, but there's more to her story, her own story, than that. So that will keep me busy for the rest of lockdown into the spring, and I hope I can come back to New York.
Yeah, I know Betsy. I mean, not well, but I've interviewed her and saw her speak at a Boston University thing with some other Dylan type people, and
she's great.
Yeah, she's great. And all right, well, we'll look forward to that as well, and maybe
we'll talk
back on here when that happens.
Maybe we can talk about Dylan next year, but you know, and perhaps we'll meet on your side of the pond.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
It's been a pleasure having me on.
I said on my on the blog page that goes with this, I'll have all the links to buying the book and so on. And well, thank you very much, and stay safe. And hopefully, the right person will be president of the United States, and the tide will turn.
Oh God, I hope so.
I know it's going to happen if we don't.
For all our sakes, no, I know what's going to happen. Dreadful.
Yeah, it could be the last presidential election ever if it goes the other way. So some people are saying. Well, on that happy note. Well, a happy note is like, was it Wisconsin we got right at the beginning of this interview? So
yes, I think so. So maybe there's some other news now.
Right. This will be interesting in a time capsule what it looks like.
Yeah, it will be. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.